Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. 6.3%. That's how high the Polish budget deficit could be this year, according to the European Commission. It's the second highest deficit in the European Union and more than twice what's considered a safe level. The country needs to bring this number down, but at the same time, it's just embarked on a massive defence spending spree. John Kennedy has more.
Poland is ramping up its defence in response to the growing threat from Russia. In 2025, it's set to become NATO's top military spender relative to GDP, allocating nearly 5%. However, this surge in defence spending is funded by borrowing and is set to push Poland's budget deficit to 6.3% in 2025, the second highest in the EU.
Maintaining such a high budget deficit over the long term could be risky for the economy. The more debt we have, the more money we need to pay for it. This leaves less for other things we'd like to do with public funds.
6.3 is more than double the EU's suggested limit, but what sets Poland apart from other member states is its impressive economic growth, which in the first quarter of 2025 hit 3.2%, and experts see this as a key tool in cutting the deficit.
This should primarily take place through the growth of the entire economy and the revenue that can be generated from it. This way, we can achieve an effect that some economists refer to as growing out of debt. Firstly, it would help mitigate the scale of debt in relation to the entire economy, and secondly, it would make it easier to service and reduce the debt.
Last year, the government came up with a deficit reduction trajectory, aiming to bring the deficit down to 4.5 in 2026 and below 3% 2 years later. However, the European Commission's spring economic forecast predicts the deficit to remain above 6% next year. But there are several other conventional ways of cutting the deficit. Some, however, including increasing taxes or cutting social spending, require the approval of the president. And with President Karol Nawrocki, an ally of the opposition Law and Justice Party, the government expects resistance.
We can expect this period of heightened uncertainty to continue. Unfortunately, it overlaps with a rather dangerous international situation for Poland. It's been hard, and it's going to get even harder.
International ratings agency Fitch echoed these concerns.
The outcome of Poland's presidential election is likely to continue posing challenges for economic reforms and sustained fiscal consolidation and may exacerbate institutional clashes.
Some Polish economists, however, have a slightly different view on the situation.
Agencies base these kinds of assessments on quite a superficial understanding of the situation. Had they looked more closely at our current circumstances, I believe their evaluations would have been more balanced. I don't see an imminent risk. Of course, political tensions may have some influence, but not to the exaggerated extent that would justify such alarm.
Still, with Polish parliamentary elections looming in 2027, some economists believe that major fiscal consolidation seems unlikely.
Is the fiscal reckoning for Poland just around the corner, or do the country's strong economic fundamentals provide it more leeway than fiscal hawks think? Well, to answer that question, we're joined by Piotr Bielski. He is Director of Economic Analyses at Santander Bank Poland. Welcome, sir, to TVP World, and thank you for taking the time.
Welcome, and thank you for having me.
So 6% is what the European Commission thinks the deficit is going to be in 2026. It's the highest or second highest number in the European Union. How long can the deficit stay at that level?
Well, the honest answer is that you never know. Definitely, when you look in the history of the last few years, because it's not the first year when Poland has relatively high deficit, higher than expected deficits. Last year, we were supposed to have deficit much closer to 5%. We ended up with almost 7%, 6.6% of GDP. This year will be also higher than 6, maybe even higher than the currently European Commission estimates. And the story of the last few years was that it turned out the deficits were higher. We were always repeating it's a very challenging situation. It will be very difficult for the Ministry of Finance to find buyers for Polish bonds to finance this big gap. But actually, at the end, it turned out that it was they were able to do it. They were able to survive. However, I would say it's a kind of classic history of boy who cried wolf. I mean, we are kind of getting used to the situation that the deficit is high. And at the end, it may turn out that there will be this moment of reckoning, and at some point, if at some point some market stress, especially for example in global markets, will come, we may end up in a very difficult spot, in a difficult moment. But we will not know this until it happens. It's not, for now, we are still enjoying relatively fast economic growth. We will be probably growing, GDP will grow around at least 3.5% this year, maybe even faster next year. So economic growth is fine, economic fundamentals are solid. But also the fact is that probably over time, this economic growth will tend to slow. And also what is another challenge is that everywhere right now, everywhere in Europe, countries will try to borrow more. So the government will queue for investors' money, not only in Poland, but in most of European countries. So if at some point some market stress appears, there may be a challenge. But until it happens, we just don't know, and we may still navigate this situation if we are lucky.
You say navigate, sir, but the government has already set as a target 3%, back down to 3% by 2028. Do you think we can navigate our way there?
I think this target is no longer valid because first, the starting point is much higher, as we said. Also, in the meantime, what we had at the beginning of this year was a relaxation or just a change of European approach to fiscal policy in general. So there is definitely, since the beginning of the year, what has changed is that the tolerance for bigger deficits in entire Europe has increased. Even in Germany, which was super strict in their fiscal policy until recently, now is shifting towards less fiscal consolidation, and also we had local factor, which is presidential election, and what it means, in my opinion, is that the risks for fiscal policy are highly asymmetric because I think the new president will block any government attempt to consolidate public finances. At least there is high probability of that, while I think he's very unlikely to block any legislation which will be good for taxpayers. For example, if the government tries to reduce taxes, I think the new president will be more than happy to sign it. But if the new government tries to cut spending at the same time, I think that the risk of government veto is much higher.
Right. Well, I just want to go back to your use of the word tolerance. You say tolerance is kind of increasing. People are used to having this level of deficit. But that tolerance comes with a cost. There's a risk associated with this. It's expensive for the government. And on top of that, of course, there's the government's commitment to paying the 5% or reaching the 5% target on defence spending. How do we manage those?
Well, yeah, I mean, all the time in doing business or running the economy, you have two sides of the coin. You have risks, and then you have potential benefits. Now Europe has decided that it's willing to take a little bit more fiscal risk to achieve its goal, which is to build its defensive capabilities, to also to expand its infrastructure, and also to boost economic growth. So that's a fact. Europe right now is taking a bit more fiscal risk and wants to use it to boost economy and also to boost its defensive capabilities. And if we are lucky, we will survive. If we are not so lucky, there could be a moment of market stress. But again, I think it's too early to be sure how exactly it develops. The history tells us that actually Poland was lucky many times in the past. And even when we thought the difficult period is ahead, we were able to finance growing fiscal deficits. And the good thing from the market perspective and from Ministry of Finance perspective is that for the last few years, Poland was underweight in global investors' portfolios. So they were not extremely involved, not extremely positioned in Poland. As a result, if anything, like there is not much to be sold. And maybe if the government is able to convince investors that it's still a stable political environment despite the outcome of the presidential election, and the economy will keep growing, those global investors may be still willing to buy Polish government bonds because, as I said, they are not heavily positioned, so they are not overweight.
So, OK, but you also mentioned earlier that the president is unlikely to approve any legislation that raises taxes or cuts social spending. So how do we get back to the 3%? Are we relying purely on overseas investors based on Poland's fundamentals? And isn't that risky?
That is risky because I think the entire strategy is to grow faster, to have relatively fast nominal GDP growth. Because actually it's very important to understand that it's high nominal GDP growth that is crucial for the government. Not real GDP, but actually nominal. So real GDP plus inflation. So the government either needs faster GDP or higher inflation, or either ideally both. The problem is that even if we can count on GDP growth, have real GDP growth relatively fast in the next 2 or 3 years, inflation is going down, and that's a challenge for the government. So if we are able to keep our nominal GDP growth at around 7, I think it would be much easier for the government. If not, then the reduction of fiscal deficit to 3% will be very, very challenging. And I think the problem is that it's not very likely that we will keep nominal GDP growth at near 7, because even if real GDP growth will be still above 3, inflation definitely is going down and maybe closer to 2.5 than 4.
Understood. Now, I want to focus on the social spending. We had Minister Domanski here, a couple of times on TVP World, and he said this was before the presidential election. He said there's absolutely no way that we're going to cut social spending. Do you think his opinion may have changed now?
No, I don't, because if anything, the appetite for cutting social spending is lower than higher. After these presidential elections, it doesn't imply a tailwind for the government; it's rather a headwind, which means that we are starting the 2-year-long election campaign before the next parliamentary elections, and the government, which feels that the public opinion is turning against them, would rather be likely to add even more social spending or run more expansive fiscal policy to win public support. That's my opinion. So in this sense, it's even less likely that we will face fiscal consolidation, or at least this fiscal consolidation will be probably slower. Look, if we agreed with the European Commission last year, then we will have no fiscal consolidation in 2025 because of the parliamentary elections and campaign that was preceding it, how would we believe that we will have any fiscal consolidation in the next 2 years when the government will feel a big pressure before the next parliamentary elections? I think it's quite unlikely.
Understood. Now, I'd like to think a little bit or talk a little bit about the defense spending element. Clearly, there is a military aspect, but there is also a political aspect to this. The United States is pushing all NATO member states to hit that 5% target. It doesn't look as though Poland's going to have much choice. Do you think the European Union may be able to step in here?
Well, actually, European Union did step in. They changed the fiscal framework in a way that they allowed more flexibility if the country spends more on national defense. And actually, that's what Polish government is intending to use. The Minister of Finance has already announced that he will ask European Commission for permission to use the escape clause, which means that we will ask European Commission to be able to spend more than actually agreed in the past in the following years, because we want to spend more on defense. But what it means is that the fiscal consolidation agreed earlier is even less likely to happen, right? Because we already know that the revenues in the last 2 years are running below the schedule, and probably next 2 years will be also not much higher than, but rather lower than designed earlier. And we are asking for permission to spend more. So that means less ambitious fiscal consolidation, which is actually for our national defense and for building the defense capability is good. And also it's good for economic growth. However, the side effect is that we will have to live with higher fiscal deficit.
Okay, well, I mean, the message I'm getting at the moment is, it's okay, keep calm. We'll manage to grow our way out of this. So the fiscal dangers, as I understand what you've said, are low. So if we're talking about, the traffic light system, if you like, what are the signs that we should be watching out for to make sure they don't go from green or amber to red?
Well, I think right now one of the key issues for fiscal sustainability in Poland is the pace of economic growth. Because, as I said, there is little appetite for cuts in spending. But as long as economic growth is decent, revenues should grow at a pace that would be tolerable for investors. At the moment when, in the event of some global economic slowdown, which will also propagate to Poland, that's the risk scenario, because we already have high deficits and we don't have any room for maneuver, right? So with second highest deficit in Europe, we already have exploited our fiscal space to react to negative macroeconomic scenarios. So that's the biggest risk. If we don't end up in a big global slowdown scenario, we should be doing fine.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us. That was Mr. Piotr Bielski, Director of Economic Analyses Department at Santander Bank in Poland. And that concludes the bottom line for today. I was your host, Ashim Kumar. We bring you the best of regional business Monday to Friday at 5:10 CET on TVP World. In the meantime, for the latest in regional business, follow us on X and on tvpworld.com for more news and analysis. Stay with us on TVP World. Goodbye.